It was yet another rocky day when it comes to the trade war between the U.S. and China. As we reported, the markets reacted strongly. Chinese and Trump administration officials are supposed to meet later this week to hammer out a trade agreement. But getting a deal done looks even dicier than it did a week ago. Over the weekend, the president unexpectedly threatened to raise more tariffs on Chinese goods. This all fits right in line with President Trump's approach to China, and that's the focus of tonight's Frontline. It's a joint investigation with NPR. Laura Sullivan of NPR is the correspondent. She'll talk with Yamiche Alcindor in a moment. But first, here's an excerpt about how the president surprised the world with tariffs on China after the two sides had already made some progress.
Their negotiators agreed on a plan for China to buy billions of dollars in U.S. products like beef and natural gas. But behind the celebrations, Trump's nationalists had devised a different plan.
We had a couple of tricks up our sleeves. Vara and I started to dust off the secret weapon we had to call a national security emergency, kind of what we're doing on the border right now. To use the national security emergency powers that are invested in the Defense Department to really start to go after steel, aluminum, maybe autos, but eventually technology. It's time to get it on.
By March 2018, the president was ready to take action.
Thank you very much, everyone. We have with us the biggest steel companies in the United States. They used to be a lot bigger, but they're going to be a lot bigger again.
Executives from the steel and aluminum industries were hastily gathered in Washington.
They were all called to the White House, had the meeting, and at that time, the president announced what he was going to do.
Next week, we'll be imposing tariffs on steel imports and tariffs on aluminum imports.
What was the reaction?
The reaction was surprise.
It'll be 25% for steel. It'll be 10% for aluminum.
This moment was a seminal moment in trade policy because it's the most aggressive use of this kind of trade law approach ever. This is done under the theory of national security.
We need it. We need it even for defense, if you think. I mean, we need it for defense. We need great steel makers.
Steel was important to our national security broadly, military, critical infrastructure, and the economy as a whole. And that had never been done before.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you. Thank you very much.
The sweeping steel tariffs also surprised America's closest allies. It turns out those tariffs hurt U.S. allies more than China. That's because allies like Canada sell much more steel to the U.S. than China does. At the State Department, the top China specialists quickly started getting complaints. What were some of the United States allies saying?
Well, certainly the allies were very much taken aback that they were the target of the steel tariffs. They don't understand the focus on tariffs. They don't understand the focus on deficits. They don't understand the rejection of the international trading, norms and institutions. They don't understand the U.S.'s rejection of global free trade, since this is the system that we basically set up.
Trump had upended decades of U.S. trade policy, determined to start a fight he felt was his.
In several meetings, even in high-level meetings with the president, some foreign leaders, offered, they said, we want to help with China, we want to do this together with you. But he seemed to think that this was his fight alone and that he wanted to do it mano a mano.
At that point, were you disappointed? Were you frustrated?
If you adamantly believe that something doesn't make sense, you're personally disappointed, but ultimately it's not your decision to make.
Within a month, Cohn would leave the White House. The nationalists had won.
President Trump turning tough trade talk into action.
New tariffs announced by the Trump administration on $50 billion worth of Chinese exports.
China is now punching back with an equal amount of tariffs on American exports.
President Trump has just slapped tariffs on another $200 billion of Chinese exports,
igniting the biggest trade war in economic history.
Of course, since those tariffs were first imposed, the trade war with China has accelerated. But the president's latest threat to add tariffs to another $200 billion in Chinese goods caught many off guard. Some see the president's warning as his way of trying to get better leverage and more concessions from China. Administration officials said President Trump's announcement came after the Chinese government dug in on some U.S. demands. For further insight into all of this, Laura Sullivan joins me now. Thanks, Laura, so much for being here.
Thank you.
So in the documentary, and in what we know now, the president has said that he's planning to increase tariffs on China. He said that the Chinese government has reneged on some of the policies and promises that they've made. What's happening there?
This is part of a long-standing message that has come out of the sort of more hawky members of Trump's China team, that China has failed to live up to the promises that it's made for almost 20 years now, almost 2 decades now since joining the WTO in 2001. They have felt that China has promised to open its markets, promised to play fair, promised not to steal American technology, promised to not force companies into technology transfer agreements over and over again, and they have failed to do that. The Trump administration's position is that this 2 successive administrations, the Bush administration and Obama, has allowed China to walk on these issues, and that they are not going to be the ones that do that. There's a lot of backstory to this, though. I mean, the United States business community did not want the previous administrations to take this hard line, and now it's sort of coming push to shove. The Obama administration did make a deal with President Xi Jinping of China in 2015 that cyber theft was not going to happen anymore, that was going to be off the table. Cyber experts say that lasted about 1.5 years, and that cyber hacking is going on. So there is reason to believe that some of the promises have not been lived up to.
We saw today how volatile the markets were. How does that factor into President Trump's thinking when we think about trade in China?
The markets are absolutely important to the Trump administration. I mean, it's personally important to Trump. I mean, this is, he has talked about this issue of trade and trade deficits for, especially with China, for almost 20 years. But the stock market to him reflects that idea over the health of the country. So there's 2 sides to this coin, because on the one hand, it's emboldened Trump and the Trump administration to be able to take on China with additional tariffs because the economy is in a good place and the stock market has been high. However, if this volatility continues, it's something that's definitely one of the few things that will hold the administration back.
In the documentary, you detail how China has used international and domestic tactics to try to grow its economy and compete with the United States. Talk a little bit about what they've been doing, but also the reasoning that their leaders use.
So the Chinese have something called the China model. It's the way that their economy is based. They can marshal the entire forces of their economic engine to drive forward in whatever the Chinese leadership wants to do. If they want to move their country toward the high-tech sector, artificial intelligence, semiconductors, basically America's holy grail, they can do that swiftly and fiercely. They have plans for 10, 20, 50 years out, and they are moving their country forward. They have done this. They have been incredibly successful. They have moved 300 million people out of poverty. No country in the history of the world has been able to do that in 20 years. At the same time, a number of people in the United States feel like the United States is falling behind.
In the documentary, you say that the nationalists won. What impact is that going to have on the future of the Trump administration, and how does that dovetail with the president's long-held beliefs on trade in China?
These fights in the Trump administration were some of the most vicious, nasty fights. That's how people in the Trump administration describe them. The reason they were so nasty is because what they were fighting about was such a passionate issue to these Trump administration advisors. They were really deciding whether or not tariffs would destroy the economy of the United States, or whether tariffs would have the ability to bring a country to heel that will challenge the United States as the next superpower. When the nationalists won and the globalists lost, and the globalists have now, for the most part, all left the White House, there is now no counterbalancing force inside the White House to hold back any idea that tariffs might be dangerous to the economy. At this point, only the nationalist agenda is on the table, and there is very little suggesting to anybody inside the Trump administration that this could be dangerous.
Well, thank you so much, Laura Sullivan.
Thanks so much for having me.
And this Frontline and NPR joint investigation, Trump's trade war, will air tonight on PBS and be watched online at pbs.org/frontline.